Hello, and welcome to Lodestar's Lending Leaders. I'm Jim Paolino, founder and CEO of Lodestar Software Solutions. On this podcast, I'm going to be talking to leaders in the mortgage and real estate industries. Our goal is to talk about current events, interesting things from their end of the industry, and anything else that we feel is fascinating. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Lodestar's Lending Leaders. I'm really excited to have on a good industry friend as our guest this week, Roy George. He's SVP, Head of Compliance, as well as a Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Taylor Morrison Home Funding, one of the major home builders in the country. So really excited to talk about all things construction, industry related, and I'm sure a host of other things that we'll get to. So Roy, thanks so much for coming on today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jim. I don't know if I'm the greatest for the construction side of the conversation, but being a mortgage person in that world, I can definitely speak to that piece. Yeah.
I think you probably know more about it than the average person for sure. So I think we can certainly touch on there. But I don't know if, I'm sure like most 10-year-olds growing up, you were dreaming of either being a shortstop for the Yankees or a chief compliance officer. So would love to hear about kind of your evolution to this end of the business.
So funny. I actually didn't have a dream to be any of those things. I was an artist or an artsy kind of a kid growing up. Mm-hmm. Comic books, drawing, those kinds of things were my thing. And so I actually went to college originally for architecture. So it does kind of fall in line with home building, right? I mean, I went to go design homes. Some of my first work were things like that, building model homes, residential types of things that I was working in with CAD and things like that. And then by the end of freshman first semester, I was like, hey, I want to do something that isn't as time consuming as this. So what's easy? And then by the time it was graduation time, it was like, hey, my grades aren't so good. How do I get out of here? And they said, well, you can go into communications. I said, well, I'm actually really good at that. So I did. And that's how I got out. But I always wanted to be an architect. I still draw today.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Is it like building related or is it just kind
of?
No,
I actually, I can freehand draw. I draw faces. I draw cartoons, all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, it's nice. They always say you need to have the hobby that like has nothing to do with what your day-to-day kind of life is. So I'm still working on that to figure out. I don't know if whiskey drinking technically counts. So I need to figure out a different one there.
A nice Macallan 12 on the rocks never hurt anybody.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, almost there. Almost end of the week for that. But and then so going from communications, what does that do with getting into the mortgage industry and then particularly really getting into the compliance angle?
So interesting. I got into the mortgage industry on the servicing side of the equation while I was still in college and mostly just to pay for things. I needed the cash. I needed to be able to pay for school, books, things like that. So I started working for Mellon Mortgage back then, servicing platform. I think Chase bought them shortly after I got there. So I was working for Chase and I was making phone calls, collecting payments, things like that, customer service. Over the years, it changed over and I was on the ops side for a long time. Started processing loans, then started managing the processing teams, eventually started to handle a much, much larger area. I was running the end-to-end operations, East Coast to West Coast, by the time I left my employer in 2008. And by left, I mean, let go during implosion. And so, so, when it was
2008.
Great year. Yeah. When it was over, I said to myself, I want to be in mortgages. I just don't know where I want to be in mortgages. And I got hired as a consultant to do some work with a compliance team, but they wanted to know the origination side of it so that they could build out some new things. And then Dodd-Frank came into play. And I thought to myself, eventually I want to become the owner or the president, something like of that nature of a mortgage company. And I said to myself, let me learn this compliance side of the business so that I can marry the two, sets of experience I have to create that person. And that's always been my goal. That's how I got into compliance.
And I feel like so often it's interesting that you kind of opted in to learn about compliance, because I think so often, especially with people who are running mortgage companies, the sales background is typically what you see, or maybe ops. So with what do you feel people get wrong about compliance when they view it as a necessary evil, or something that, okay, we have to check a box?
So I think a lot of the times what people get wrong is not keeping the compliance people or the compliance portion of the business, right side to the business operation itself. A
Mhm.
lot of the times it's exactly what you said, right? Oh, we made a mistake. Now, how do we fix it? Rather than let's just not make the mistake by putting some guardrails in. Because I've had both sets of experience,
Mhm.
I'm really good about understanding where the rules and regulations begin and end, and how
Mhm.
to kind of fit myself in the middle so that customer experience and the loan process is the primary driver, and making sure we stay in a good place from a regulatory perspective or a state
Right.
examination perspective is important, but is
Mhm.
being covered because of the things that we put in place, not that it's the primary driver of anything.
Right. And going back to kind of your communications experience, which I'm sure comes into handy, how do you communicate that when you're dealing with a sales manager, someone who is just looking at compliance as something slowing down his team from making everyone money?
Sure. So right now, I'm lucky to be working with a number of people that
Mm.
are really pro how do we get it done, Roy, rather than, hey, stop trying to get in my business, Roy. Right. So those are two
Mhm.
different kinds of people. And I've had to deal with both of those kinds of people over the years. I've got a
Mhm.
really good group right now. They're very compliance friendly. They want to make sure that they're in the right space.
Mhm.
Um, and so when I do, in a rare occasion, run into someone who maybe, stuck in a space where they feel like, hey, compliance is just here for whatever reason that they have in their head, I take some time to really go over the whys. And I think explaining why it needs to be there helps the business line to understand if we need to make a process change, if we need to make some kind of policy change.
Right.
It's really being able to get the business lines to understand the why. Because the why is the hardest part. At the end of
Mhm.
the day, nobody wants to understand a regulation because sometimes they're just overbearing and
Mhm.
let's take that back. All the time they're overbearing.
Well, I think it's important to keep that in context, right? Because it's not Roy from compliance telling you to do something. It's this regulation XYZ telling you to
Right,
do something. So I think
right.
communicating that and being more of the messenger makes more sense. In terms of looking at that alphabet soup of regulations right now, which one takes up most of your time at the moment? What's the biggest concern?
Well, I mean, up until about a week ago, the biggest change wasn't a regulation change, but it was the move over to the new loan application. So it's been
Hmm.
my primary focus, making sure that I'm working hand in hand with the IT and project management staffs to kind of
Hmm.
ensure an easy and seamless transition for our teams. Also, outside of that, I've been really honed in on what changes the CFPB may make, and some they're already making, and how
Hmm.
that's going to affect things. I think I see a lot of um, items that were prior to the last administration coming back. And
Hmm.
so we'll see how that fares or we'll see how everyone fares as those changes
Hmm.
may not be changes, but reversions back
Hmm.
to what used to be.
What are some areas where you're seeing that?
So UDAP is one, right? We just saw an article come
Mm.
out 2 days ago or yesterday about making sure that we are focused on, let's say, putting the CFPB back in a space where they're able to provide civil money penalties for what they deem to be UDAP violations. Another really interesting one in the last couple of days has been the focus on fair lending. And what an interesting piece, right?
Mhm.
The rule has been no discrimination from a fair lending perspective, no
Right.
discrimination. And the word is um, sex, right? They're meaning whether male or female, right? That's what they meant when they wrote it. And the CFPB released a notice the other day that was about gender identity. And so no discrimination based on gender identity. So they're elaborating on the rule or regulation without actually getting a rule or regulation changed, right? So that's interesting. They're not getting the law changed, but their own interpretation is making it so that it includes gender identity. And honestly, I feel like that's a great thing, but it from the justice standpoint of this is what it says versus this is what you're saying it says. That's a really interesting view, and it really reminiscent of the Cordray CFPB versus the Kraninger CFPB.
Right, they're kind of they're expanding the definition of the rule without necessarily creating new legislation.
Right.
Based off things. And I saw that as well as the kind of their heightened awareness on fair lending, specifically with sexual orientation as well. And I think that's going to be really interesting because fair lending has so many different components to it. And I like to think that most companies are not out there necessarily trying to do something that is unfair by design. But I think there's so many traps that people can fall into with some of the ways that they have things together. To give you an example, the way we see it a lot in our compliance business is LO comp, right? I've listened to calls where an LO talks to someone who has 10% down, can pretty much get a conventional loan. All of a sudden they're pitching FHA. Right? Is that because of their commission? Like, is that why exactly are they doing that there? So I don't know I'd be really curious to hear what you feel are those types of systemic things at companies that can get them in trouble, especially with fair lending, and have that kind of unconscious bias.
Well, so I'm lucky enough to work in an atmosphere where, our pipeline is really kind of coming to us from who's buying a house, right? Versus retail atmospheres where you may run into situations like that. So I think the focus on LO comp over the last 2 years has been really well received. I know a lot of people in the industry have been trying to make sure that they adjust to it. And to be 100% right now, I think the last 3 years, everybody really had it pretty down packed. They've been avoiding anything that could really be looked at as switching for the purposes of an increased commission. I really don't hear that kind of a thing in the compliance boards or the message threads out there. I really don't hear that. So I think the industry in general has done a good job at avoiding that unconscious bias application to their customer base.
Are there other areas where you feel like it can be improved? Like, what are kind of the pitfalls? Or if you were to go into a new organization that you don't know anything about and you're now their compliance officer, what are the types of things that you would start to investigate to determine kind of that level of risk?
So I'll tell you a piece of advice I give to anybody going into a new company in a compliance capacity. First and foremost, those first 60 to 90 days are just to observe. You have to, because if you're not going to sit there and take a look at what everyone's doing first, you can't make suggestions. Going in on day one and saying, hey, you need to do X, Y, or Z, that's not going to go well. And that goes back to the question you said earlier about how do you get everybody to work well with you from a communication standpoint? Well, sometimes the communication tool is using your ears and not your mouth, right? So that's a big piece for that. As far as what else could we do or what else are we seeing that is really driving behavior like that, I honestly feel that after the last couple of years, we're not seeing that. And if we are, they're one-off, smaller companies, people who are not on radars that get away with, something that they may not even know that they're getting away with because they don't think there's anything wrong with it. A good example is, I know when I see some brokers that do business, I see some loan officers at those brokers' offices who say, I don't have to send an LE because I'm third party originating and the lender is going to send it for me, right? Well, then you take your continuing education classes and there's the contradiction that says, no, you need to send an LE even if you're a broker, right? So these are the types of small items that you can really hone in on to make detail level changes that'll help the organization. But again, I don't see huge systemic type items in my organization or almost anywhere that I'm reading right now.
Well, then how are you looking at things kind of data wise to prove that out in terms of, is everyone getting quoted the same rate, right? Like what are the types of things you're doing to make sure that those aspects of it are following?
So that's a fair lending question. And really it's about match pair testing, right? So you'll see a lot of compliance companies come in and they'll do a match pair testing type of fair lending evaluation for you. What they're doing is they're taking your data out of your system and they're really taking the time to identify people who are identical or as close to identical as possible, credit profile, work profile, income profile, et cetera. And then going down to the loan terms to say, were they offered the same loan terms? And if they weren't, how could that be if they have identical profiles, right? So match pair testing is a really good way to tackle that exact type of scenario.
And that, I guess, to your point, is more likely to catch those one-offs in those cases where the same couple with everything similar in terms of credit score, profile, house, socioeconomic, but a different demographic gets a completely different rate, or their appraisal is completely different. Like an article that was run on MSNBC lately, right? So all these different aspects. And when a situation like that is caught, or attention comes to it, what should the next steps be in the industry? Obviously, if it, either industry at a whole, less so than your specific organization.
Sure. So, if it's a one-off, then it's simply about using your compliance management system properly, identifying it, figuring out how you're going to train an individual and getting them into a better place on how to do it the next time, right? The incident's already happened. You're not going to be able to erase that, but you can correct it going forward. So that's in the situations where it's a one-off. If you do find from your testing that you do have a systemic issue where you have maybe a handful of underwriters or a handful of whoever they may be that are continuously making a decision that may not be based on strictly the credit profile or the borrower profile and may be leaning on something else, then the escalation there is to bring it to someone like myself or bring it to an executive team, inform the president right away and see what the strategy is going to be to address that. Those are the initial next steps. Naturally, depending upon where that goes, it can go, a number of ways, but we always hope that it's nothing more than a one-off and it's a good opportunity to train someone.
Well, then I think you make the point too of using the data to inform you if that is a one-off or that is a trend. And I'm sure with match pair testing, you can pretty quickly see when something becomes a trend versus a more isolated incident.
Absolutely.
And you talked, it seems like you talked about dealing with these problems reactively, which I'm sure is a huge part of what you need to do as a compliance officer, right? Something becomes a problem. Now we have to deal with it. With these types of issues, how do you feel you can work on them proactively? And I don't know if this is kind of a good segue into what you're doing as the diversity and inclusion officer as well, because when people are able to kind of see themselves going through the process, it might be a little, I don't know if that's something that can hopefully prevent these isolated incidents.
So I like fair lending assessments for both the reactive and proactive steps you can take, right? First off, you're doing that every 2 years, every year, every quarter, whatever you're doing it, you're going to be able to say, hey, this is what I see has already happened. You can also say, these are trends I'm seeing that aren't an issue yet, but could possibly become one. And that's your proactive step to put some, process changes in place or, talk to the business lines about how they can adjust for that. Also, I think when you're looking at regression testing or second line of defense type things, which is what your compliance teams are supposed to do and what they are, you're always in that it's already happened kind of scenario. You can always put procedures and policies in place and help the business line define those, but you can't make anybody follow them
Mhm.
Unless you're hanging over their shoulder every day, and
Right. No one
that's
wants
not
that.
the game.
Mhm. So then, in terms of looking at things a little bit more proactively, what are the types of things you do to put those in place to a way that people view it as a value add to the organization?
Sure. I like to do a couple of things, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
have what I call a trending data analysis. I
Mm-hmm.
meet with the business line leaders once a month to go over items I'm seeing when I aggregate everything, right? So first line of defense, quality assurance type
Mm-hmm.
information, post closing quality control information, warehouse line information, regression testing information, put it all together. And now you're taking on a much bigger scope of loan data. And you're saying to the business line, hey, look, we've looked at 4 different areas, and we're
Mm-hmm.
able to see some similarities. How do we go about addressing
Mm-hmm.
that? It's a really good way to get ahead of anything that may grow into something you don't want to deal with later. So it's definitely a recommendation that I make to everybody in the industry, especially when you're at a mid-sized lending institution.
It seems like data can be your best friend in these cases, right?
It
Of like, let's
really
back
is.
up. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, you talk about some ways you can use data from a compliance perspective. In your role as diversity and inclusion officer, are you trying to utilize data in a similar way to make those points in those conversations?
So it's funny when I teach some of the things that I teach in regards to diversity and inclusion, or when I'm just speaking about it in general.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of what is being said is based off of data that's gathered from the industry or data
Mm-hmm.
that's gathered from different agencies. And then I formulate a lot of my content from that.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I don't think there's a part of the business anymore that isn't really uh, based on being data driven. Not data
Right.
driven, but being data driven. So I think it's an important piece that everybody in the industry should be looking at. It really talks to how are we going to move into digitization if we're
Mm-hmm.
not relying on that data in
Mm-hmm.
a much larger sense. And there's a lot of push over the last couple of
Right.
years to digitize and do that kind of thing. I mean, that's how I met you.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so
Mm-hmm.
that's a big push. And from a D&I perspective, we look at companies that provide information on our employee base. We look at companies that provide information
Mm-hmm.
on what kind of demographics are in the area, who's living around where your offices are. How can you hire diversely? How can you
Mm-hmm.
bring a diverse group of people into your company and still remain, I guess I want to say, still remain in a space of integrity, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot that you can do with that data, but you have to be willing to go through that data. From a
Yeah.
DEI perspective, sometimes that gets cumbersome. Sometimes you got to make a
Mm-hmm.
whole new group of people just to do that, and
Mm-hmm.
then that's sometimes the deterrent for it. So
Mm-hmm. And when someone's looking at that and kind of, seeing all of the work that's involved in getting that data together and making those decisions, like how do you represent the benefit and the why of that, of not only is this the right thing to do, but this is actually what the ROI is going to be from doing
sure,
this?
I think that kind of information has been shown quite a bit from companies like McKinsey and
Mm-hmm.
people who do actually gather data and provide that kind of thing. So, many studies have shown that if you have a diverse workforce, you're going to get immediate return on your ROI. Why? Because you have
Mm-hmm.
diversity in thought, and diversity in thought is what drives that.
Mm-hmm.
Also, when you have management teams that look like your employee base, you have loyalty to the organization because people see
Mm-hmm.
themselves in what they see in management and they
Mm-hmm.
see that track to get there. So you're maintaining or retaining that diverse employee base with the notion that they have the ability to climb a ladder where they are and they're
Right.
happy with that kind of thing. So all of this data, all of that action is really what makes DEI from a hiring recruiting standpoint
Mm-hmm.
really work. I think there's quite a bit more to it when you're thinking about how to utilize that data and where
Yeah.
to uh, you know to leverage that data. But from a recruitment and a hiring standpoint, that's one that I focus on a lot when I'm looking at this kind of stuff. Those are your best ways to use it.
And obviously a lot more to get into on this topic than we could possibly cover in this conversation now. I know it's a very complex.
I like the way that you're steering everything, because the truth is, question one, when you first asked me, and this one just now, I was sitting there thinking to myself, wow, the whole conversation is going to be this, because it could be hours of just this topic.
No, we're keeping you on your toes right now. So one last question kind of on the D&I perspective though, and you alluded to looking at the demographics of an area, and obviously a diverse workforce in Sioux Falls, South Dakota is going to look different than in Atlanta. So how do you take the area into context and then also update your hiring practices to get that diverse workforce?
Well, the right answer to that is carefully, but the practical answer is, take a look at what your MSA or your Metropolitan Statistical Information looks like, and really understand what is diversity for you in that area. If your office is in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and it tends to have a particular demographic of people, then, you need to expand what your criteria is, right? Is it people with communication degrees? Is it people with business degrees? Is it people with something else, right? There are ways to go about looking at diversity from more than just the, I guess, the mainstream topics, right? Like race or sex, gender. Those are the mainstream topics, but there are multiple ways to look at diversity where you're not just looking at those things.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And that's one thing as I do more hiring, trying to be conscious of where are you putting those applications up and what does that lead to, depending on if there's certain universities you're putting in applications or even certain websites or anything like that, of really thinking of how can you broaden that scope.
Right. And, take the first simple step, right? Diversity, when you're talking about any area, if you have a particular racial makeup, then maybe immediately you start looking at, well, what's my male to female comparison here? If you have, an area where you have 60% females and 40% males, then, you have, and you feel like your company's representing that, then maybe you're looking at something else. Eventually, and you got to start somewhere, right? You got to start somewhere looking at something. And eventually, maybe you have a program that's robust enough to look at everything holistically. But I don't think as an industry, and not just our industry, I don't think as a whole, the economy is in a space of getting there yet. All industries aren't there yet. So, take your first steps, whatever they are. And I mean, I commend you for just having that type of thought process when you're looking at new hires.
Well, there's so many little things I think that can affect that. And when you talk about first steps, and I think a good place to start is what little decisions are you making that can affect that? And for me, an easy area was unpaid internships, right? Who can have an unpaid internship is generally a pretty biased thing, right? So I feel like there's a lot of little decisions when you're doing this type of thing and bringing people into your organization, who's representing your organization, who's going out there. Like there's so many little changes that I think are good starting points, opposed to people, doing something that they feel is a lot more drastic.
I love that example, Jim. Honestly, I love that example so much, right? You're spot on. Who can take an unpaid internship? Well, I can tell you this. I was one of those students that would not have been able to do that. I needed to make a paycheck in order to pay for school. If I tried to take an unpaid internship, that's time I couldn't use. And there may be the benefit of the experience, but unless I was getting it paid for, there was no way for me to be able to succeed that way. So
you can't need experience.
And that's great that you're looking at it from that angle, man. And that's a really, really important piece to think about.
I think it gets to one of the points we touched on before, is not only is it the right thing to do, but if you pay someone, you're gonna get better work. Like they're gonna do a better job too. And quite frankly, you as an organization take it more seriously. So obviously there are a lot of altruistic reasons to get involved in so much of this that's going on in the world right now. But I think it is important that we're organizations that are for-profit businesses. So like, let's figure out a way to also do it that aligns with our goals. Because when you do that, it's going to stick.
Right. I agree with that 100%. Yeah. That's a great viewpoint. Great thought. I think it matters from so many different angles, bringing new people into the industry. I mean, when you think about it, I'm in my early 40s. Really? I'm still one of the young people in this industry. That's a terrible thing to say.
Yeah.
That's, as far as my opinion matters, that's a terrible thing to say. Yep. I'm 40 something and I'm still one of the young people in this industry. Well, then I blame myself and everybody else for not making sure there are more 20 somethings and 30 somethings that are in this industry.
Yep, absolutely. And then what little things do you feel can be done to do that, though, too, in terms of getting more young people into the industry, or just the small changes, like I mentioned with the unpaid internships? What are the types of things you've looked at on your end to kind of move the needle?
Did a demo with a company called Way Up not too long ago, and they have some strategic ways to target college campuses. It's a great option. You're finding graduates that come in that register with companies like that, and then they're able to send those resumes to you. So you can start to do things like that. You can actually maybe work with some of the local groups. For instance, in the mortgage industry, we have NAMBA and Tony Thompson's team over there. Great efforts. And I love what they're doing, and that goal they have to get, a certain number of young people into the industry by 2025, I believe it is. That's great. That's the type of thing we need to be doing from all angles. If you remember, I want to say 20, 30 years ago, there was the program when I came out of college. There was a program with American Express where you go into the management program and you'd work your way up. At Citi, when I was at Citi years ago, we had this thing called the Mortgage Associate Program, and it allowed a person to come into the company and maybe spend 6 months in different roles of mortgage processing, mortgage closing, and then we would let that person pick what they thought was the best thing for them. Maybe there are tweaks to be made now that I've learned so much over the last 20 years, but I think conceptually it was unbelievably one of the best ideas I've come across.
And do you feel like mortgage companies do the opposite, where they just say, you're in this department and you're going to do this very specific thing?
Yeah, well, think about it. Right now there's so much demand for underwriters and processors, and the pay is going up and up and up in order to, satisfy that demand. And honestly, whether you're a mortgage company or a title company, whatever you are, you need to be looking at how do we train more college grads and more just young people. You don't have to go to college, but how do we train those people to get into roles in the mortgage industry? How do we make it so that they think there is a career here, there is something that they want to be a part of? I came from a fintech company before I came to this company, and that fintech lender, there were so many perks from a millennial standpoint that at first when I got there, I was kind of like, wow, it's like a party in here. But, looking at it 5-6 years later, I can see what the benefit was and why people want to be in that atmosphere.
Yeah. I think it's very important to think of those types of things when you're offering something to employees and the benefits. And I was talking to someone about the need to have an employee retirement plan. And the answer I got was, no one's going to retire while they're working at your company, so you don't need to offer a retirement plan. And I was like, well, I don't think that's the point, right? Like, it was just kind of one of those things where, it's like, so I think, those benefits and those perks, obviously, they can be viewed, especially by older generations, as something like, oh, like that's not, you don't need to do that. But you think of the competitive advantage, you want to retain talent, there are things that have that positive ROI from it.
There's a company that I talk to the president every once in a while, and they're based up in the Midwest, up north. They have a really cool concept. They've got video games and all kinds of things where you can take a break and go do what you need to do to just reset your mind. And I'm not talking about just like, a Nintendo over there or a
No.
PlayStation or something.
Mm-hmm.
I said Nintendo. Wow. But
I was nodding. I followed you. Yeah.
but there the virtual stations where you can play a video game in VR, and
Right.
I mean, it's pretty cool.
Well, then you think of too what's going to be the new version of that now, with people working remotely or at home, or more flexible schedules, or things like that. Like, how are you going to adapt, especially in industry like the mortgage industry, which is probably going to be pretty slow to adapt?
Yeah, I mean, if history serves at all,
Yeah.
the mortgage industry is slow to adapt to everything, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's really going to rely on people who are, our human resources
Mm-hmm.
groups. We need to partner with them fully to make sure that we're helping to drive what uh, workers want right now. And if
Yeah.
it's going to be interesting, right? Once everybody's in a vaccinated space, and
Right.
maybe some companies are saying we may never have people come back, or that's the new normal, or whatever people are saying, there's always going to be other companies that say we want to have people back in. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the leadership out there
Yeah.
really makes this work. I think there are some really cool options if you marry things like what my previous fintech employer was doing with what other mortgage companies that are not fintech mortgage companies that may not be looking at that millennial base of employee are doing. Right, there is definitely a marriage there. Maybe we change the floor plans a bit to be more conducive to other things other than just sitting in your cubicle and
Right.
working. So
Well, then I think it's important to figure out where your employees are, because there's plenty of people who probably want to be back in an office right now, and plenty of people who don't. So you have to be more flexible in that regard. The thing that I always find interesting too is, while a lot of people in any industry, but we're going to pick on the mortgage industry here, may not want to work with millennials or work with the younger generation, and will say, certain things about how hard or easy they are to work with. They all want to sell to them, right? And like, those are the people who are going to be buying homes, first-time home buyers right now. So I think, you talked about your previous employer, who I think a big part of the reason when people want a more younger base is who better to sell to that younger base than people right around their same age.
yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, there's probably a purchase storm coming sometime
Yeah.
soon. The largest group of millennials is, I think they're 29, 30 years old, and peak buying age is 32, 33. So,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are expecting one thing, and I have an opinion that because of this millennial cohort age group, that we may see a push on purchases rather than, what some people are thinking may be a slowdown. There's of course, supply, which is going to be
Right.
a slowdown issue. But outside of that, when you're talking about millennials and buying, you want to have the group of people working for you so that you can have that capability of relating to the customer base.
And I think that's a good segue to kind of our final topic when you talk about looking forward, especially with the purchase market. And it seems like a great solution to the supply problem is, will someone build more houses, right? And like, sure enough, you're sitting there at one of the largest home builders in the country. So how do you feel home builders are looking at what's coming? Especially when people are reluctant to move out of their current house. So where resale is a lot more unlikely than new home builds.
It's actually interesting, right? So I think you're seeing a lot of resale get pulled off the market. I don't know why. I can't really tell you why people are pulling it off the market. I'm sure there's a bunch of reasons.
Right.
But from a new home construction standpoint, I know that the National Association of Home Builders released some information over the last couple of days, right? So their Q4 2020 surveys showed that about 27% of millennials are still planning on buying a home in the next 12 months. That's actually up from 19% same time last year, right?
Oh, wow.
So that's an interesting statistic to kind of say to yourself, all right, well, there's still room here, right? Also, when you think about credit availability, a lot of first-time home buyers use things like an FHA first-time home buyer program. Well, government business on the credit availability index has actually increase slightly. So that bodes well for the purchase market as as a whole. So that's really good, right? First-time home buyers using that FHA type program, that's going to be a really good thing. It just means that credit standards are loosening for those types of programs, and that means you can still get more people in there, right? I think also another really interesting fact on the same or on the opposite side, same coin, the National Home Builders Association or National Association of Home Builders also released a graph. They called it the pyramid or something, and I read it the other day, where they said about 21 million people in the U.S. Can't afford to buy a $100,000 home, right? So now the focus becomes people who are making X amount of dollars or more. So there's a lot of ways to go about keeping that purchase market moving forward. But, there are hurdles and, lumber costs. That's something we all hear about in the news regular basis, right? They've definitely increased quite a bit. I think in some article I read the other day, they tied that to the tariffs that were created in 2017 and kind of spurred or grew from there. And so, demand is high, supply is low. I think that supply piece will remain in place. So demand will continue to be there. And I honestly think that we're going to see a good market for probably another 18 months without any real hangups.
I mean, here's hoping. Do you feel like home builders are doing things to be intentional about building homes that type of group, especially the first-time home buyers, want to buy? Or is it different? If lumber costs this much, let me build a larger home. Do you feel like companies are trying to match that supply to the people they want to build homes?
So I think a lot of people that build homes, and this is from my own home buying experience, has nothing to do with my company, but from my own home buying experience, I find that some home builders have much more or better price points for first-time home buyers. The homes might be smaller, homes might be a little different, but I think they're all doing a good job at bringing technology to the forefront, bringing health to the forefront. And I think from a millennial first-time homebuyer perspective, those things are really important, right? I want the Nest, I want the Ring doorbell, I want the HEPA filter that is 99.9%. I want all of those things as a millennial buyer, and I think whether you're this income bracket or that income bracket, as a millennial, there is somebody building a home for you somewhere.
Yeah, well, let's hope that supply is able to keep up, and we can see kind of strong things to come.
Think about it this way. I think these tariffs are probably going to be reversed or something of that nature, or lifted or changed. And I think, so if I remember the article correctly, the tariff was actually on softwoods coming from Canada, right? So that's where the tariff got put in place in 2017. It grew from there. So I think that if we can lift that tariff or change that tariff or change whatever that is, then I think we can start to see that lumber cost kind of either reduce or level out or whatever it is. And then naturally that will help the supply and help to even out the buying experience,
I wasn't aware of the lumber tariffs and the effect on that. The only tariff news I saw was last week that UK was actually they were going to be lifting the tariffs on UK whiskey. So to your point about that, Macallan is going to get a little bit cheaper, which is going to be good going forward. So I was happy to see that. But one of the things to your point about tariffs that I really find fascinating endlessly about this industry is so many things can touch it. We're talking about international trade. We're talking about consumer buying habits, demographics. And we didn't even get into technology right now. And that's also, we're going to have to do that next time. But what do you feel is the thing that kind of gets you going and gets you up in the morning about this industry?
So I'll tell you this. It's not technology. It's not DEI. It's not any of that gets me up. It's not even mortgages that gets me up. If I had one thing that makes me get up every morning, it's my teams. It's the people that work on those teams. I run 5 different areas of my company, right? It's appraisal, compliance, quality control, training and education, and disclosure. And so even though there's a relevance to all 5 of those, or a relationship between all 5 of those, it's the people that work in those groups that really get me to get up in the morning. It's the capability of saying, hey, I can coach someone, I can help mold someone, I can help grow their career. I can help them learn about how to get to the next step. Because going back to that DEI piece, if I don't help the manager who's 30 something really grow and strive and become the next thing that they want to become, then they leave the industry and go be a manager of something else. Because management's a skill that you can transfer. Maybe disclosures is not a skill you can transfer to another industry, but managing a group of people, you can. And if you're not getting that with your company, you're going to get up and go somewhere else. And, I strive to make sure that my people are getting that from me and that they're giving that to their people.
What's the old saying? People don't leave companies, they leave managers.
That's right.
I've certainly found that to be true. Well, we're up on our time here. Thank you so much for coming on. We had a lot that we covered. This was really fun. Is there anything you want to plug or anything you want to, where people can find you? I know you're pretty prolific on LinkedIn, so I do want people to check that out.
No, nothing that I want to plug, man. But absolutely. When when you post this or wherever you post this, I'll make sure to share it on LinkedIn. And I'm just happy that you had me come on, and I really appreciated that. That was cool. I got the chance to listen to some of your podcasts, and you're doing great, man. Keep it up, and hopefully one day I'll come back on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'd love to have you again. Well, thanks a lot, Roy. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks a lot. Bye, Jim.
Have a great day. Bye. Thanks for listening to Lodestar's Lending Leaders. Please like and subscribe wherever you get this podcast. If you have any ideas for upcoming episodes or would like to be a guest, please reach out to us at lendingleaders@lssoftwaresolutions.com. Hope to hear from you.